Hi, everyone. This is Jaime Alejandro with the Arts Calling podcast, the place where I interview hardworking, independent creatives in the literary, visual, and performing arts. Once again, a quick reminder for you. In each episode description, I have one weekly shout out, so be sure to check out the links. There's always exciting projects from previous guests, such as new publications, podcasts, and other independent projects, so be sure to take a look. As always, thank you for supporting independent artists and for stopping by the Arts Calling podcast. So let's get the show on the road. Today, I'm delighted to be Arts Calling Amanda ReCupido. She is an author, book reviewer, playwright, storyteller, and podcaster whose work has appeared in various humor and literary publications, as well as been recognized in several screenwriting competitions. Follow her online at Amanda ReCupido. As always, links are in the episode description. Well, folks, this was a phenomenal conversation. I walked away feeling incredibly inspired, not only by Amanda's ability to tackle a variety of different forms and genres that she's working in. There's a lot of projects across a wide spectrum of creative possibility, but the way that she creates blends not only her background in marketing and her interest in a lot of different social issues that I feel makes her work like a call to action. And I felt really inspired, especially because she's tackling a lot of issues that are important to me as well. So stick around. I hope that you enjoy it. And without further delay, let's give Amanda a call. Hey, Amanda, good morning. How are you?
Good. How are you?
Oh, wonderful. I really can't thank you enough for taking the time to chat with me today. There's so many things that we got to talk about, and I'm grateful for your time. So where are you at these days?
I am situated just outside Chicago in the suburbs. I can no longer take the cred for being in the city. I'm embracing it.
So you were in the city, or was that something that was a part of your life? You lived in
Oh,
Chicago?
of course. I mean, I grew up in the suburbs, immediately once I left college, which was in the cornfields in central Illinois, went to New York City, then back to Chicago, and now I'm back in the burbs. Said I would never do it, and here I am.
No, that tends to happen to a lot of us.
It
I
does.
think for my life story, just replace cornfields with prairie and wind, and you get the same story. But I guess cornfields was not something that I associated with Chicago. So first and foremost, that's definitely a revelation to me. So what was it like growing up in that area? If we could start at the beginning.
Yeah, and so growing up in the suburbs, and do you want me to kind of talk about like my art growing up as well?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the fun part. What were you working on when you were a kid, when you were first starting to discover that inclination?
And it's so funny because I feel like a lot of what I'm doing now is getting back to those instincts as a child. Because it was one of those things I didn't even think about. It was just one of those things. I remember having like this little tiny hot pink Hello Kitty notebook that I filled with gibberish at age 4. And I'm like, oh, I wrote a book. Um, my mom, I'm the firstborn as I'm wearing my eldest daughter's shirt, which is very much a part of my journey. My mom was very big on, reading to me and teaching me words. We do flashcards, even before I was in kindergarten, just so I had a good vocabulary. And I give her a lot of credit for my love of reading and my love of words. And once I moved back to the suburbs and was getting boxes and boxes of all my old stuff that my mom kept forever, I was looking through these old school papers and I was writing stories all the time.
Mhm.
Even things like I didn't remember, total like fantasy fiction. And even I struggle with fiction right now. And it's like, wow, I had this talent and it was nurtured for a while. And I was always known among my friend group as the writer, all through high school and, then college is what was the cornfields. That was Bloomington, Illinois. And did like the literary magazine and, English major, like all of that. But then, it was adorable when I was a kid coming up with these really cute stories. And I was really good with rhymes, and that comes up later in my life too. All these like kind of parodies. And then I get to college, it's like, oh, so what are you going to do with your English degree? You're going to be a lawyer, right? And it's like, wait, what? I thought I was, adorable writing my little stories over here. And, my dad even said, like, what, you're going to be a poet? And it's funny because now, 20 years later, one of my really good friends from college just had his first book of poetry out to like critical acclaim. And, it takes time. And I've seen in my life, just like keeping at it. Um, so just, continuing on with my life story, I kind of had that like, what do I do with my life moment, as many of us have, especially when it comes to art. And I think for a long time, um, and understanding too, my parents wanted me to have a secure life, and there's many reasons where that came from. I would say, my dad is artistically minded. Like he had a really good ear for music. My brother has that. I had it for a little bit until I stopped. My brother like does photography, so there's definitely some artistic genes in the family, but no one who is a professional artist. So like the practical side of things, my grandmother who's still living, like, was an immigrant. So there's a lot of that hard working. So that's like where the path was like, well, I have to make money. So what do I do? And get to New York City where it's very expensive. And I took this publishing course. I'm like, I need to do something with words. I don't know what. That's when magazines still existed in, the mid aughts. Missed those times when the internet was fun. And it's funny. It was really the difference between as little as like $5,000 to $7,000 to go the editorial path or go the sales and marketing path. And at that moment, it's like that made a difference. And that kind of set a trajectory for me. And I love my career and I love all the experiences that I had. But I went the PR route. And so my proximity was supporting artists versus being the artist. And I worked at theaters and, these other performance spaces. And again, saw people where maybe they were in a bit role. And then 10 years later, like they're writing and directing their own film. So it's like, I also saw the path and that it's possible. And during this time too, again, it was like mid-aughts. So I was writing my blog, even when Facebook came out, I was doing the Facebook notes. So again, I was always putting myself out there. And a lot of my work is very confessional. It has to be personal. And some of that, as we'll talk about, like gets into the political. It's like just whatever is really speaking to me at that moment that I have to get out and express is kind of what drives me. And then, I moved back to Chicago. I met my husband. We got married, and then we were sitting like watching HGTV just like on a weekday night at like 7 p.m. And I kind of had that moment of like, okay, is this the rest of my life? Like, what am I doing? And again, checked all the boxes, like good job, everything. And, still married, all that was the good decision. And then I read The Artist's Way.
Oh, bless you.
I forget.
Yeah.
I know. I forget who recommended it. But then I just, tears.
Right.
Started therapy again. I don't remember which order that was, but it was kind of this moment of self-discovery where I'm like, okay, I've spent the last 10 years, doing this for other people, and now I'm going to turn it on myself. And at that time, I'd moved on from like doing PR for arts organizations and was at like a PR firm, like an agency, where it definitely was like, okay, it was really fun in my 20s, being anti-man. And now I'm like, okay, what's the man paying? Like, you really need to get some funds here. But in that job, and here's where everything like comes full circle, because I learned, how to pitch new business. And that is like a pitch deck for a story, how to sell yourself, I know how to market. And so really this current decade that I'm in has been focusing on my own writing. And I think one of the takeaways, many takeaways from The Artist's Way, but just like, you don't need to do art full time to be an artist. All you have to do is call yourself an artist. Like no one is going to force you to do your art or champion you more than you will. So you have to do it. So it was putting that self-discipline that I was putting towards others, towards myself. And maybe not quickly, but as I'm sure it was like this buildup, and then it was like crescendo. It's like I was getting all this success. And what I find most interesting to me, I learned that I've loved the process. So even I'm a person again who like maybe has puts a lot of stock into external praise, but realizing that I loved the process no matter what, as long as I felt integrity with what I was doing, then it didn't really matter. Everything else was like a bonus. I wish I could say the same for everything else in my life, but I'm not there yet. um, yeah, and I think also too, like everything, like timing happens for a reason because I think I was too immature in my 20s to kind of do the things that I'm doing now and like remove my ego from it and realize, it is the product first and when to let other voices in and when to listen and step back and all of that. And that takes some emotional intelligence that you just don't get in your early 20s. So I'm really happy with the place I am right now. Yeah, I'll pause there.
This is a wonderful introduction. I'm so grateful that you kind of took the time to give me the arc because you're kind of having me go into a lot of different directions, and it's exciting because I find myself in a similar situation where I felt like I had to get myself out of my head, and that did take a good 10 years. What is it about 10 years that maybe you need to just be out in the wild, in the wilderness that is challenging you at every turn, especially as an artistically minded person in this world? I think you and I kind of feel the same way about the man, right? And trying to reconcile some of these inner conflicts about like, yes, I have to survive and I have to justify myself as an artist. How do I do those things at the same time? But I guess maybe to start here on this, because there's so many things I want to ask you. How do you feel that that started on spooling for you? This sort of reconciliation against like what your values used to be and what they are now, because it feels like you're at a very even keel of understanding yourself and sort of being okay with it. And I do feel that maybe Julia Cameron was part of that process, but if you could elaborate a little bit on it, because it's such an emotionally painful thing to accept where you are in life and still be an artist and move forward with confidence and understanding and love for yourself. Which sounds like a hokey thing, but I'll let you take it from there.
No, and I mean, I'm totally woo woo. Like
Yeah.
I've been doing yoga for like, God, almost 15 years. I'm a big journaler. My house is full of magical rocks. All of that. I'm like your typical horrible white woman who's got, all of that stuff. Um, yeah, it takes a lot of inner work. And I think also the reason I was only able to start focusing in earnest in this decade versus my 20s is like I was an asshole in my 20s, as many of us are. I was, in many ways wounded from various stories I told myself or just influences from my upbringing of the way, the way I experienced the world, the way the world told me I should be, especially as a young woman, coming of age in like the early 2000s, which was hella sexist. So to stand in my voice and a lot of my writing was processing some of that sexism too. And I think it was also a time where the culture had shifted and here's where the activism part comes in because I've always been similar to a writer. Someone defined feminism to me in like grade school and I was like, yeah, that sounds right. That's me. So when a lot of people were like, oh, there was that whole period of like, I'm not a feminist, but I never had that. I was like, why wouldn't you? And I got increasingly more active in that. So I would say being in New York in my 20s, I was in close proximity to like groups like Now and all these like great, like anti-assault, pro-reproductive rights groups that didn't get mainstream attention until probably this past decade when things really came to a head. But
Sure.
everything that we're seeing now was warned about. I mean, as soon as I was fresh out of college, but way before then too. This has been decades in the making. So where was I going with this? This is all to say, like, it takes a lot of unlearning and processing to figure out, like, you have to figure out who you are before you know what you're going to say. And for me to write, I can only write something when it's like done. Or maybe let's say I can only publish it once it's done. I can write it in the moment and process it and then like edit it with a cool head to see it more objectively. Because there are some things that aren't out yet that honestly have taken a decade to write, that are more personal. And some of it is like that slow. Oh, I am still living this. And I think it is having the patience with yourself to recognize that that's okay. I'm really inspired by a lot of stories of, and I don't know the age without it having it Googled in front of me, but like, Margaret Atwood didn't go to grad school and she didn't publish her first thing till whatever age. Alice Munro, I think, was later in life too. Yeah. So all those things are encouraging. Um, yeah, and I mean, and I would also say another chunk of my story is it was in the pandemic, and here's where privilege definitely sets in. I did take a break from work. I took 9 months off. Um, I was burnt out from what I was doing, and I no longer had the time to write on the side. So I'm like, let me just spend some time and do this. Um, and I produced a play I had written. I produced a podcast. I did all this other stuff. I was reviewing books. I kept myself really busy just to see what would that full-time writer's life be like. Well, I have, of course, a spouse who is supporting me
Yeah.
financially. And what I realized, like, oh, this is why people have jobs, because like they need to teach, they need to do something. And I realized that my career actually does pay pretty well, and can support that artist lifestyle. So I still, when you're saying like reckoning, like I am the man still. But now my job, it's less, things are important, but they're not as urgent. So I have I'm not necessarily working with words all day. I'm doing something that's very like organizational and fits like that type A part of my brain. And then I have the space to be a little silly, and express words and all of that.
That's incredible. I think that we put so much stake in like just being 100% committed to the art, and I feel like there's a lesson here that I'm struggling to articulate to this day, and that's the ability to find work that doesn't completely destroy you. I feel like it's so difficult, especially for artists who need the flexibility in their life to be creative. It's just so difficult. But once you arrive at that place, I mean, I think it's excellent to be able to pay it forward in a way and to kind of share with people how you balance these things. So thank you for sharing that.
Yeah, and also jumping in on that note too, it took me like that full 9 months to like undo the productivity from my self-worth. So by the
Yeah,
time I got the job that I'm in now, I'm like, okay, my job is not who I am. Like I do
right.
good at it, like I like it, all of that stuff. But like if I lost it tomorrow, I'd be fine.
Yeah.
Like I'd have to find another job. But like as my identity, it's like I still know who I am. And that was a big shift because for so long, and I think just in America in general, it's like what you do is who you are, and it shouldn't be the case.
Yeah, and that's very much it. I feel like I experienced that the moment I graduated, and the job market's a little bit limited here, but even back then, because I think I'm more like your generation, I graduated right at the peak of the recession in 2009.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So my first job with a bachelor's degree was at a liquor store for minimum wage, and I was like, that's the most humbling thing that could ever happen. But I feel like it's taken this long for me as well to get to that situation of like, why did I just keep convincing myself that I was only as good as the work that I was doing? I mean, even creatively, I feel like maybe that's another type of wound to talk about. But since you're talking about confessional work in particular, I'm curious how you sort of balance that, because that is an added bit of commitment to the craft that really takes a lot out of you. And how do you allow yourself to not get pummeled down when something like that is maybe not seen as positively as you would have hoped?
Yeah, that has been a journey, to be honest. And so when I first started writing again, is what I how I define that period. I mean, it didn't start that way. It started with like humor pieces.
Mm.
So it's like, oh, here are all the coping mechanisms of the way that I process things. Um, and I'll say it was probably most pronounced. My husband and I went through a couple of years of fertility treatments, and still don't have kids and are happy with that decision now. But the way I processed that whole time, it started with humor pieces, and then there were some, personal essays that were, a little more sad and emotional. Um, And then there was like kind of a click moment, and it might have been when we were towards the end of it, because again, I was on all these hormones, and I was just like not myself. I was not my most well. On the one hand, I was like being productive to not think about it, but what was I actually producing? Um, and I realized I had all these bits and pieces, and I ended up like splicing and putting them together. And that's kind of, at first it was a web series, and then I wrote a pilot. And then I was like, well, who's going to produce this pilot? I was looking into doing it myself. And then the pandemic hits. I'm like, what can I do remotely? And that's where I came up with like the narrative podcast. And that's it's done pretty well, and I'm very proud of that. And then, of course, all the Supreme Court stuff happened with Roe, and it's like, wow, my story is actually fitting into this because, I mean, in many states, like even like IVF is not available or not as available as it used to be. So then again, this very personal experience became very political. Um, but so that is something that it was mainly my story, but it's also my husband's. So that was definitely a moment where I had to make sure he was okay with things. Because most of the time I'll put myself in the worst light, but for a good story and in real life, it does take two to tango. So it helped us honestly process some things that we hadn't together, or that he knew I was feeling, but maybe not the depth that I was feeling. Even, people in my extended family who were like, wow, I didn't realize that you felt this way. I'm so sorry if I didn't support you in the way that you need it. So, I mean, here is where art can help heal. I definitely had women. I remember I got this message from someone like in the UK or something who like read an essay of mine and was like, I'm scared, I'm starting this thing, what should I know? So, I mean, I think that's a topic, there's more and more now, but there hasn't, it's been very hush hush. Now there's research and people like me who are like making humor, making lemonade out of lemons, and other stories, which is fabulous. And we need more of it. But that, again, that shows how art can heal. But I mean, yeah, when you're writing about other people, or when you're writing about topics that people may not know are part of your story, it's always scary. But I always feel better once it's out there, and I realize, okay, nothing horrible happened. I can do it again.
That's phenomenal. I feel like a lot of us have to learn how to be this open, but I'm curious of how the marketing aspect or the PR aspect allows you to start voicing these things louder than the average person, because I feel like it's kind of a superpower. Many creatives, are more obsessed with the process. I feel like I'm one of those folks who's just so preoccupied with beginning, middle, and end, trying to figure out the creative issue, right? But then comes the difficult part of getting this message out, and you seem so effortless in this ability to just get it out there, no matter the medium. And I want to talk about that too, because I love this ability to just climb to whatever different creative possibility there is. It's very exciting to me. But if you could elaborate a little bit on the PR aspect of it and why it's so important for artists to understand that this kind of skill is imperative in this day and age.
Absolutely. And this is something that comes so natural to me, but I know it is a struggle for so many artists. And I mentioned my friend, the poet, who, you know, did not have social media, like hates talking about himself. And I had to like sit him down and be like, brag, this is your moment. And he ended up, he was working with an actual PR firm that did fabulous work. Um, and, the art is one thing. And I know it can be cringe to put yourself out there, but if no one, the tree falls in the forest or whatever, it's like you want people to see your work. And, I give my mom a lot of credit. Like something that's always stuck in my mind is the worst they can do is say no. So just put yourself out there. They might ignore your email. They don't know you. Who cares, if they delete it and think you're nuts. But if they are interested, and that's how we're talking today, um, it's fun to talk about your process and your work, and people are interested. I was thinking, I just wrapped up the latest season of Hacks, and Paul W. Downs is on all these podcasts, and I love listening to like how it all came together and season by season. And I don't know, if you're a writer, if you're an artist, like you love that stuff. So why wouldn't you? Um, and I would say this mostly, other than like, oh, I published an essay and posting it on my social media, it really used my skills when I did this parody play. And here's where, this wasn't just me getting some work out there. It's like, oh, I got tickets to sell. And again, since I was producing it, and I'm like, okay, here's what we need to, make our budget. I didn't have any like sponsorship or grants or anything like that. So I was really dependent on ticket sales. And I was also very dependent on good friends, like my designer who did the artwork for the zine that I know we'll talk about. I've collaborated with her a few times, and actually we worked together at a PR agency. So we already worked well together, and I'm like, hey, you do great work. You can read my mind. And I really respect visual artists because it's like, I know what I want. And I know that they're also probably driven crazy by words people who are trying to describe it. But I'm just like, you know how to, whatever I say, you know how to translate it, and it works. To get like a signature image from her. And I'm like, great. How do we use this? How do we do this cheaply? Reaching out to media contacts, but also, really grassroots. So like making sure we had a cast of like with understudies, maybe somewhere between 10 and 14 with like our director, everything else. So make sure you're posting on your social media, like here's your postcards, put them out here are all the areas I want, who's going to take what. So there's a lot you can do very cheaply, or even for free, calling in favors. And again, like make the favors count. For this, it was a big production beyond myself. And it did well. Like I put it up at this, like piano bar in Chicago. And then at that time, IO Theater was reopening, and we were one of the first shows to reopen that new space under their new management. That was incredible. Yeah. And then that show even got the attention of another, call it like a burlesque act, this trio in Chicago. And so talking with them where it's like, here's a list of everything you can do yourself. There's places you can do free listings. And, I'm not going to take all the credit, but that next show was one of their most successfully attended shows. And now they're going on a Midwest tour, like
cool.
1 year later. So I love seeing their journey. And again, I think it takes time to build an audience. So all that promotion just helps you build an audience quicker. But the work is going to speak for itself. So once you get them in the door, then it's all you. So don't be afraid to do part one, because then people are going to emotionally connect, hopefully, and then be your best marketers and champion you themselves. Because that word of mouth, you can't pay for that. And that's the best.
Yeah, and I think that's a good segue into the zine, because I think that we can pick up on some of the multi-form and multiple forms of creativity, because I'm really intrigued about that. But if you could tell me a bit about how those previous collaborations led you to the new zine that that just came out, right? It was just a few days ago.
Yeah. So the zine is part of the Zine a Month Club, which is run by this woman out of Chicago, but it's truly worldwide. She said she's got subscriptions like all over the world. I think Asia, South America, Europe. Because I remember asking her, oh, is it mostly Chicago? But no, it's truly all over the US and beyond. So this the artist, her name is Ray Young. She's amazing. So we collaborated together on this musical, doing the artwork. She also helped with the podcast artwork. Love what she did. It was called Inconceivable. So the O was like one of those test lines from like a pregnancy test. So I just knew that she knew how to take a concept and take it beyond even what I can envision. So I've been very involved, as I am in a suburb of Chicago, in my local community, and as what is happening with several Chicago suburbs, or even, around the whole country, there's been some anti-library, anti-LGBTQ, anti-public anything groups. And my library is one such target. So here's where the art and activism again comes into play. Started with activism and kind of settling that fire. And then I realized I wanted to talk about it, because anytime I talked about libraries, a lot of people just didn't know what was going on and that it was happening so close to their own backyards. And in their very liberal backyards, again, just half an hour outside of Chicago. So I had this zine originally started as like a children's book that I was shopping around, because I have young nieces and a nephew. I also read to them all the time. I mean, like their parents read to them too. But I joke, since I don't have kids, it's like, oh, I'm like the aunt that's radicalizing them. So I was like, oh, let's write this children's book that talks about all the things that libraries are beyond, story time. Because you can rent podcasting equipment from a library. With all these streaming services, like I remember when, oh my God, the actor from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and he was on Homicide, when he passed. Homicide's not streaming anywhere. So I'm like, I bet the library has DVDs, and they did, and it was amazing. Um, there's just so much. Social services now, just like everything, they've become community centers because that more and more is getting lost. So started as a children's book, wasn't really finding a way to do that, whether through a publisher or doing it myself. I started just talking to people about libraries, and I kind of wrote like a 10-minute play that I'm calling like the Vagina Monologues for Libraries, where, I talked to someone who lived in Oman and China, and like there weren't really access to books, or if there was, it was very limited. And just, all these people's stories of like, someone growing up very rural, and like that's how they learned about like sex, because like didn't learn it in school and didn't learn it from their parents. So just like fascinating stories. And as I was gathering this and like thinking about what I wanted to do with this zine, because I did want to use this medium somehow. It was actually Ray who was like, this needs to be more personal. It needs to be more memoir-like. And I realized that my story in my local activism was the story to tell. Even though I kind of like experimented with these other angles in. So when you're talking about different mediums, because I have done many different things, as I've mentioned, like the humor, and then the more personal essay, and the play, and a podcast. So I think to me, it's also really fun to take a story in one medium and just see where it goes. Because I don't think I'm done with this library story. I do think even from that, like from the zine or that 10-minute play, I think there's something to combine there. And this is where I say, love the process. It's like something can be complete in its own and then continue to grow as like you live it, or just more work is created and they're building blocks that kind of create something bigger onto itself. I can see it as a larger stage play, and I'm kind of eyeing Natalie Moore, who's a journalist in Chicago, did something similar with abortion rights, called The Billboard, that was like based on a true story about a billboard on the South Side that was like anti-abortion, and then like created a play around it. I'm also thinking of like, oh, this would be great to do as like a Parks and Rec meets Abbott Elementary about libraries, because there is a lot of humor to be found. And humor is often what can help change minds. So there's a lot of different aspects. And I think my ability to have like the humor and the depressive like weigh in, have your vegetables and have your dessert too. So yeah, it's so the Zine a month, you can sign up. There's a Patreon and there's an Instagram. Every month, it's like $5 a month. You get a different zine from a different creator. Again, like all over the world, essentially, all different topics. I love it. A lot of creativity. And yeah, I'm just excited to see what the reaction is to it. And I think that also will inform like where I go with this collection of stories next.
Oh, that's amazing. First of all, I have to commend you for the work that you're doing in your community, because in my opinion, the attack on libraries is one of the most nefarious things that is happening right now in our country. And it's so evil that it just, I mean, maybe it's close to home because here in Wyoming, we have such issues with that. We had a neighboring library that just experienced some really horrific things. And so it's very personal to me because knowledge is literally all we have. So thank you for the work that you're doing with that. If we could talk a bit about some tools or some ways that people could get involved in this kind of activism, because there's a low point of entry here for the kind of impact that one could have. And especially for people who are in these kinds of rural communities too, where like we need to mobilize a little bit more because there's a bit of complacency. So what do you think we could do to begin conversations about this stuff? Through the art, because I think you're onto something to try to get people to connect through humor and to do it through art. So maybe if I could get you to rant a little bit on that, because it's very useful.
Oh, be careful. Crack the knuckles.
No, go for it. Go for it. I yield my time to the floor. Yeah.
Oh my gosh. There's an excellent book I just read called They Came for the Schools. It's by a Texas journalist, blanking on the name right now. And it's about a community called South Lake, Texas, but it's the playbook for everything that's happening around the country. And again, schools, libraries, it's anything public. It's public institutions. The goal is to privatize, and there's reasons why. Yeah, the barrier to entry is very low in some of these communities, and all it takes is one person to step up, and you better be the right person. And here's where kind of like send the email. The worst they can do is say no. Like I felt so compelled to step up in my community, and this is a big community. We're 50,000 people, and I'm not saying like I'm the only one who can do this. Like there are other people who have communication skills and everything like that. I'm in a unique position where I don't have children and I have more time. And because I'm no longer doing really like client work at my job, and I came up in nonprofits, I know how to do the advocacy work. It's like, well, my volunteer is that, and art being tied to that. And I think what I talked to a friend about this too, whether it's like art or direct activism is the better way to make change. And it really is both. And personally, I have to recognize that I can't do it all, nor should I. And it is like training up other people around you to take on the work. Like you can't do it all yourself, nor should you. And I think what I'm doing in my community, so I'm part of the Library Foundation. We are in this like moment of change where, at first people were involved before any of these challenges, just because they loved books, and, you raise a little money, like, maybe you purchase a few things for the library, but we were never like on this level of scrutiny, or certainly like media attention. I mean, our library had, I don't know about national attention, but definitely, well, actually we were name checked in that book that I just referenced. So yes. Yeah. So,
Yeah.
I mean, and I think like we are a community that people are looking to because it was historically red. And I moved out here in 2016, right before the election. It was purple and is getting more blue. So this is kind of why the attacks are happening. But what I say about, and this is in the zine too, if you want to get involved, a, you have 5 minutes, you have a day, whatever. Use your library, first and foremost, because they check those stats. Get a card, check out banned books, attend programs, tell your librarians they're doing a good job because they need the moral support. The whole, if you get a complaint or like get someone harassing you, that's going to stand out. You need like 10 compliments to like balance that. So please just continue encouraging your public service workers. Show up to your library board meetings would be the next level because a lot happens there. And what I've noticed, these groups, sometimes that's just their social activity. They want to hang out and they all have the same talking points and they just cause disruption. So again, to balance, to counter those negative comments, show up and just say, hey, I love the library. I attended this program. It was great. Thank you for having these books. Love it. That's all you need to do. You don't want to show up if you're busy, write an email. That goes into the public record as well. Volunteering, giving money. Libraries need money. What I've learned just in the last year or so, every library system is different. Ours is part of the village, so we're not an elected board, we're appointed. So all those local politics, all the local elections matter. And, it's like less than 20% of people show up for those municipal elections. A lot of them are uncontested. Running for seats yourself, running for school board. In most communities, unless there's, issues like this, no one's paying attention. And you don't even, depending on what there is to do, you can
Yeah.
kind of just volunteer like at a bare minimum and just making sure no one's like taking it, back to the dark ages. But we need more people giving their time for sure.
Yeah. Incredible sum up. I think that's really well put. And man, there's so much that we could rant about here because it's on my mind. And I know that this is just one of the many things that you're concerned about here because we have to find other ways to make our communities better. I know that reproductive rights are, a huge problem in our country right now. But if we could for a minute just diverge, but I got to thank you for that because that was incredibly succinct and useful. But if we could elaborate a bit about the creative process and how similar it is across different forms for you, because as you're working on something, say a play, and you want to transform it into an essay, or maybe is that does that equate into the creative process for you, or do you just say from the get go, this is a play, and I'm just going to see it through as a play? How do we go from here? Like how do you work with your stuff?
Ooh. Yeah, and I'll use the example of it was the parody musical that I did, because that started as just like a joke that I made to a friend on a text. Yeah, so sometimes I don't know what things are until they become what they are. And then I think I was bored at work one day at my last job and just kind of like typed out like the synopsis truly in a Google Doc to make my friend laugh. And then I was like, what if I put some dialogue to this? And then I'm like, I think it wants to be a musical. So it just kind of kept snowballing. And then I got to the point where I'm like, actually, I don't know how to compose music. I'm really good at writing parody songs. And this comes from being a child and like making up parody songs, and like background in poetry. Like,
Okay,
so
I gotta stop you right there. Is this something that's like millennial sort of thing? Because I think I used to write like lyrics, like parody songs, or maybe it was the Weird Al influence. I don't know, maybe
it might be
of our
that.
generation. Okay, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I just thought it was
Yeah. Or
curious.
even like, yeah, Adam Sandler, like a lot
Uh-huh.
of, I mean, not that like musical comedy didn't exist before, but I think that was,
It was
yeah.
big during the like 90s, 2000s. I think it had more prominence than it does now for some reason. Maybe it's just me.
Yeah, yeah, or like as YouTube was starting, yeah,
Sure. Sorry, I
because I
didn't
didn't like
cut
grow
you
up
off.
knowing Weird Al. Yeah, no, but I think
Yeah.
that's all valid. Um, yeah, so then I was connected with a composer who kind of, much like my collaboration with the artist, just like took it above, where I'm like, okay, I wrote this to this song. So this is the style I want, but like make it sound different. And she was just incredible in doing that. And again, it was one of those like in the pandemic where like, let's do a Zoom reading. And I like learned things, tweaked things. Um, and it just kept evolving. So I do love that process. Um, but I think your question is more like when it jumps forms. And I think it is also like my MO is just like make your shit. I think it's great. And I am like also currently writing like, feature screenplays and things like that. But it's like, I can't make that myself. I'm not going to necessarily wait 20 years or whatever it takes to get like a film produced, if ever. So how can I take something I've written and do it in another way? So I do think there are some great theater companies that are doing like audio productions, and you do have to tweak, obviously something that's visual, something that's more audio driven. Um, and then being in Chicago, we have such a robust theater community where it's like, okay, write it in the medium you want and then adapt it. You can always go back to another version, like you can always tweak
Sure.
it, but like the story is at its core. So this is the whole, content is king versus the medium. I don't know. I love playing with form.
Yeah. I kind of pry on this because it's such a liberating perspective that a lot of people really don't have. You get hung up on I'm a literary writer or whatever, or I'm just a playwright. I'm just this. We have an affinity to just kind of bottleneck ourselves into whatever, whatever thing we think we're best at or we're good at. But there's something liberating about just again being like a child and just saying, I'm gonna go where the intuition leads me. I'm gonna go where the novelty is. And I think that that's sort of like a I don't know, maybe it's an obsession with branding now, and maybe you could explain this to me, like, if there's a correlation here between, like, if I want to be known as something, I have to be a specific brand thing, like a playwright who does this. That's my brand. Or is that how marketing works? I mean, what do you think are creative people up against in this world where you have to become a brand? Perhaps one
Ooh.
of specificity. How does that affect the way that people should be making work now, or should it? Should you just be you? Now think about the plan.
Yeah, I mean, I think that branding conversation only comes into play when you're like famous. Like when you have like an agent or a manager who's like,
Yeah.
how do we bring you to the market? I don't like, especially at my level, I'm not going to concern myself with that. I'm just going to have fun and do what I'm doing.
Right. And so you're saying, and I'm sorry to interject, but so this is a conversation that we shouldn't even be worrying about then, because like it's not something that it's going to be a hindrance, right, to you as a somebody who's starting.
I think it's limiting right now. Um, and yeah, and I would say like I'm more successful than like a non-writer, but I'm not like a famous writer. And is that even the goal, or am I just content as long as I'm making stuff? And right now I'm always ambitious, but I think as long as I'm doing stuff, I'm happy. And that's again comes back to that like self-worth thing. It's like I'm still an artist, even if I haven't written in a month. Like I'm still putting stuff out there. And yeah, and I think like because I've certainly positioned myself to agents. I don't have one, I've come close, but I think also playing with form is like, okay, as much as I want to be, a novelist or like anything, maybe that's not my strongest medium. I actually found writing scripts, like who knew I could write a script? So I think there's also ways, and again, like having this podcast out there is getting more attention than having a pilot that's just sitting on my desktop. So I think there's something to be said about being flexible, because like if you do get hired, let's say, a lot of stand-ups or playwrights get hired as TV writers. So you do have to be adaptable. We're thinking about people who have made it, like Donald Glover, like he's an actor, a writer, producer, and a musician.
Yeah.
Keanu Reeves has a band. I don't know if Jared Leto's the greatest example, but people who have multiple disciplines.
Yeah.
There's more than one way to be creative. And in one sense, maybe if I'm Keanu Reeves, like the music is the creativity and John Wick is the paycheck. I don't know, but I think it's different for every person. But why limit yourself? Like you're a fully realized individual, just follow your passion.
That's perfect. Now, I got a couple more questions to be mindful of your time, but this has been such a blast, and you're inspiring me so much because I feel like I fall into the traps that you've solved a long, long time ago. So it's very inspiring to me to see this come together.
I don't know if it's solved, but
No,
I'm glad it comes across that way.
At least with the clarity. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you for reminding me.
Marketing.
Yeah. It's like we solve this stuff, but we got to remind ourselves time and again that we're doing okay and everything's going to be okay. So,
Totally.
as you kind of see the zine coming out into the world, I'm curious what kind of lingering feelings you have, about the project and what's on the horizon for you specifically that you're working on right now.
Yeah. And I think the goal with that, because it's also being mindful, and here's where it is like writing about other people. I kept my community's name, and notice I didn't say it in this podcast at all. And part, I want to protect my community. There was also a challenge working with my designer, because the more specific the story or the more specific the art, the more compelling. But I think we found a nice balance. And I wanted to make sure that I printed the zine at my local library, that the library was involved in the process. And it was so nice. Like the librarian at like the computer area, like helped me, because there was like some complicated technology even for
There
me.
usually is.
And there's a nice old lady who was just like sitting at the computer area being like, "Ooh, what are you working on over there? That looks fun." And gave her a copy. So ran into my library director when I was printing everything out. And at first I was like, "Ooh, like am I going to get in trouble for telling this story?" But it's also a public story. Like it's in the news out there. And it's telling this side. And I think, it's hard to be neutral in these times. And sometimes just telling the truth seems political, but like it clearly has an angle of like libraries are good, but is that a liberal message? Who knows? Probably is. So again, and I think the audience who are signed up for the zine a month are probably on the right side of that argument. But I hope, it does inspire folks if they're in Wyoming or elsewhere to kind of be like, hey, what's going on with my library? Because there's even people in this community who haven't heard, even though it's out there. And yeah, and I mentioned, there's some other library themed projects I want to work on, but there's still, and so my husband is a writer as well. His career has been journalism. We collaborated on a children's book about 6 years ago. Um, yeah, and it's the irony too. That's when we were going through like the fertility stuff. Um, and I don't know, we're just like fun aunts and uncles together. And we're also working on, might even get into it today, um, a adaptation. If you're familiar with the Christmas song "Dominic the Donkey,"
A little bit.
yeah. I need to look into like how the copyright works and everything, but like I'm very Italian. It's the mob's essentially response to Rudolph, realizing there's no story around it. And we're like, wouldn't that be hilarious? Like it's an animated like Christmas special, dream casting, Stanley Tucci, like, all of it. Um, and again, that's just something that's like, here's a funny idea. What would that actually look like? We did like for New Year's, we just got like an Airbnb in Wisconsin in this cabin, and just like wrote out like the first draft. And we got some readers. So now we have some edits to go through. And then kind of the next step. And again, when you put things on the calendar, that's your deadline. There's like a staged reading we want to bring it to next month. So again, it's like this kind of slow process. I've also been working with one of my actors from the play I did, working on a one-woman show for her. And that kind of evolved. I was even looking at like a draft, I guess like a memoir that I had done. I'm like, oh, this could be a one-woman show. And then it's like, well, let's bring in elements of her life. Again, do we want to make it cabaret? So again, just kind of like experimenting and seeing where it goes. But I like working with collaborators, because then it's not all on me. I have someone to be like, hey, we're good, right? This is in a good direction. Because I can project manage, but it's also nice when someone else is, helping you do the work. So yeah, I just remain curious. There's other projects to get back into, and I think art is all about managing inertia. It's, sometimes I'm doing too much and then I take a break and then I'm like, oh no, I have to get back into it now. So yeah, finding the good balance.
Amazing. You're dropping a lot of knowledge today, and I'm gonna ask you one more, and I hope this one is it just sort of fits, because I feel like I get pretty sentimental, because I do get woo woo, I do feel like there's a lot of that in my life, but I've started to think more and more about what it means to lead a life well lived, and I know that you and I have talked about this in the whole episode, but it is a preoccupation now as an artist and as a parent and as a married person and a person with a job and a career. Uh, I'm curious how you have come to define what a life well lived means, on your day to day. Not even as an artist, just as a human being. How do you get through the day? What are I don't want to say mechanisms or coping mechanisms, because that's really not it, but just where do you find your contentment, and how do you define that in your life?
Ooh, yeah, this has taken a lot of work. I mean, the easy answer is like balance. And I was listening to an earlier podcast of yours, where the woman said, what do you want your day to look like? And I think what I learned, especially in my little career break, it's like, oh yeah, like going to yoga and writing would be perfect. And visiting my nieces and nephew, like that would be like a perfect life. And when I did that for 9 months, and it turns out I also need some structure and I need to like get dressed and see people. um, so kind of learning that, good art is also made with a little bit of pressure. Um, I mean, maybe not for all people. I think for me personally, I need, I also continually seek tension to push against so that I can make good art. But some people, want to go into the woods and not talk to anyone for a couple months and come out, with like a masterpiece. Um, but I think, I do have a good balance with like, yes, I have a day job, but it does give me some freedom. I used to work jobs that my nights and weekends were spoken for, because I was working for the arts. But now I can enjoy the arts, and not work for them. I can, and I do. I see a lot of theater. One of the artist ways tenets is to take yourself on artist dates. So I always think there's so much to explore within your community. Go on like little local outings, go for a walk, um, just be with your own mind. Um, so I do think it is finding that balance. It's not working too much. It's not, being lethargic too much. And I just recently had like a moment of imbalance this past week. Um, But then it is like, okay, just go to yoga, like be in your body, like do what you need to do to get back to that place where you're ready, I guess, to explore yourself creatively. And actually, I'm going to read because I have it on a sticky note right here on my computer. And I think I got this. I have a friend, Ron Hogan, who was one of my first editors for like a blog that no longer exists in New York, came out with this book about writing. And this quote is, "The creative self is the happiest, healthiest, and most productive form of the true self." So I think, again, when you're looking at like the hierarchy of needs, it's like creativity is, it's not food and shelter, but it helps you become a self-actualized person. So when you can get there, that means everything else in life is going pretty good.
I think that's a beautiful note to end on and very life affirming. So I can't thank you enough, Amanda. I know we just scratched the surface with a lot of the work that you're doing, but it's really been a pleasure. And I want to thank you again for the work that you're doing that is very, not just politically minded, but very relevant and emotional and true, but for your openness too. Like this has been such a blast because you reminded us that it's so nice to just be open in the world and not be bogged down by the labels of the world. Yeah, it's been a blast. Thank you for the reminders, I should say. It's been personally moving
Yeah.
for me. And
No, this has been lovely. Thank you for the conversation.
yeah, and hopefully next time we can chat with your collaborator as well. I know that we intended to have her here, so maybe down the road we can talk more about visual collaboration because I think it's the podcast definitely needs it. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right. Well, I'll let you enjoy your day, but again, thank you so much, and I'll be in touch on the internet. But you take care, okay?
Yeah, you too. All right, bye.
Bye.